Eduardo Silveira, a powerful businessman, never imagined his life would change on a cold night after a charity gala. But when he hears a cry in the parking lot and finds an abandoned box, he uncovers a secret that could ruin his reputation or give him something money never could. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The night air cut through Eduardo Silveira's designer suit as he stepped out of the Grand Imperial Hotel. The charity gala had gone exactly as planned. Another successful networking event where he'd secured 3 new business deals. At 45, Eduardo had mastered the art of turning social events into profit opportunities. "Mr. Silveira, your car is ready," said the valet, handing him the keys to his black Bentley. Eduardo nodded without smiling and slipped the young man a $100 bill. He never carried smaller denominations. It wasn't worth his time. The parking lot was emptying as the city's elite disappeared into their luxury vehicles. Eduardo checked his watch, 11:30 p.m. He had an early meeting tomorrow with Japanese investors, and he needed his usual 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep. That's when he heard it. A soft cry, barely audible over the distant traffic noise. Eduardo paused with his hand on the car door. He looked around, but the other guests were too busy with their own conversations to notice anything unusual. The sound came again, a whimper that somehow pierced through the cold night air and straight into Eduardo's chest. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. Probably just a stray cat, he thought, but something pulled him toward the darker corner of the parking lot, past the perfectly arranged luxury cars to where the hotel staff parked their modest vehicles. The crying grew louder. There, partially hidden between a dumpster and a stack of empty boxes, sat a small cardboard box, the kind used to deliver office supplies. Eduardo approached cautiously, his expensive Italian shoes crunching on the loose gravel. When he peered inside the box, his heart stopped. A baby, tiny and red-faced from crying, wrapped in a thin yellow blanket that was barely enough protection against the October chill. "My God," Eduardo whispered, his usual composure shattered. He looked around frantically. The parking lot was nearly empty now. No one was watching. There was no sign of whoever had left this child. Eduardo gently picked up the box, and something slipped out from beneath the blanket, a folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, he opened it. "If you found my baby, please take care of him. He must never know the truth, that his real father is Eduardo Silveira." The world tilted beneath his feet. Eduardo had to lean against a car to keep from falling. Memories flooded back. A woman with chestnut hair and sad eyes. Marina. A 3-month affair he'd ended when she started talking about a future together. That had been. He counted back. About a year ago. He'd changed his phone number afterward, a tactic he'd used many times when relationships became inconvenient. Eduardo looked down at the infant. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at him with dark eyes, his eyes. "This isn't happening," he muttered. Just then, the baby started to shiver. The night was getting colder. Without thinking, Eduardo removed his cashmere coat and carefully wrapped it around the box, creating a warmer cocoon for the child. His mind raced through options. Call the police, child services. But the note. If this got out, the scandal would be devastating. His company's stock would plummet, the board members would have a field day, and the child would become a media circus attraction. The baby made a small gurgling sound, and somehow it cut through Eduardo's panic. He looked down at the tiny face again. His son. He had a son. "You're coming with me," he decided, lifting the box carefully. At least for tonight. Eduardo's penthouse apartment took up the entire top floor of the Silveira Tower, the skyscraper that served as headquarters for his tech empire. As he entered, the automated system turned on soft lights and adjusted the temperature. "Welcome home, Mr. Silveira," came the pleasant voice of his smart home system. He set the box down on his marble kitchen counter. The baby had fallen asleep during the drive, nestled in the expensive coat. "What now?" Eduardo asked the empty apartment. He'd never even held a baby before, let alone cared for one. He pulled out his phone and hesitated before dialing. There was only one person he could trust with this. "Rosa? It's Eduardo. I need you to come to my apartment immediately. It's an emergency." 20 minutes. Later, Rosa Mendez, his executive assistant of 15 years, rushed in wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. "What happened? Are you—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the box on the counter. "What is that?" "Not what. Who?" Eduardo carefully lifted the blanket to reveal the sleeping infant. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. "Eduardo, whose baby is this?" "According to this note, mine." He handed her the crumpled paper. Rosa read it quickly, her eyes widening. "Marina, the marketing consultant from the Toronto merger?" Eduardo nodded. He should have known Rosa would remember. She remembered everything. Where is she now? Rosa asked, already approaching the baby with more confidence than Eduardo had shown. "I don't know, the note doesn't say." He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time in years. "I don't even know if it's a boy or a girl." Rosa gently unwrapped the blanket. "It's a boy," she confirmed, "and he can't be more than a few weeks old." She checked the baby thoroughly. "He seems healthy, but he'll need formula, diapers, clothes. Can you—" "I'll order everything for immediate delivery," Rosa said, already typing on her phone. "The 24-hour baby store owes me a favor." Eduardo sank onto a bar stool. "What am I going to do, Rosa?" In 15 years, she had never heard him ask that question. Eduardo Silveira always knew what to do, always had a plan. "First, we take care of his immediate needs," Rosa said practically. "Then we figure out the rest." Within an hour, the penthouse looked like a baby store had exploded in it. A bassinet now sat in Eduardo's minimalist living room, surrounded by packages of diapers, wipes, formula, bottles, and tiny clothes. Rosa showed Eduardo how to prepare a bottle and held the baby while feeding him. "He was starving, poor thing," she murmured. "I'm going to need to find his mother," Eduardo said, pacing back and forth. "Marina Oliveira. She disappeared after we ended things." "And then what? Force her to take him back?" Rosa asked, raising an eyebrow. "A woman who left her baby in a parking lot isn't looking to be a mother." Eduardo stopped pacing. "I could pay her, set her up somewhere comfortable in exchange for her silence." Rosa gave him a long look. "And the baby?" "Foster care, adoption. There are systems for this." "Systems?" Rosa's voice hardened. "This isn't a corporate restructuring, Eduardo. This is a child. Your child." Eduardo looked at the baby now cradled in Rosa's arms, so small and vulnerable. "I don't know how to be a father." "Rosa, I never wanted to be one. Neither did your father, as I recall," Rosa said quietly. The words hit Eduardo like a physical blow. His father, Victor Silveira, had been a cold, distant figure who measured his son's worth by his academic and later business achievements. Nothing Eduardo did was ever enough. When Victor died 5 years ago, Eduardo had felt more relief than grief. "I'd be just like him," Eduardo whispered. "Only if you choose to be," Rosa replied. She stood up and carefully placed the baby in Eduardo's arms before he could protest. "Support his head like this." Eduardo froze, terrified he would drop this fragile creature. But after a moment, something shifted inside him. The baby's warmth against his chest felt right somehow. "I'll need to do a DNA test," Eduardo said, his business mind still working. "Of course. And keep this quiet. No one can know until I figure out what to do, so I understand." The baby made a small sound and nestled closer to Eduardo's chest. Without thinking, Eduardo gently swayed back and forth, a natural motion he didn't know he possessed. "He needs a name," Rosa said softly. "At least for now." Eduardo looked down at the tiny face. "Matteo," he said suddenly. "I don't know why, but—" Matteo, Rosa repeated with a smile. "It suits him." Eduardo's phone rang, breaking the moment. He checked the screen. "It's Gabriela." Rosa's expression tightened. "Your fiancé might have opinions about this development." Eduardo let the call go to voicemail. Gabriela Vega, daughter of his biggest business rival and his fiancé of 6 months, wouldn't understand. Their engagement had been more of a business merger than a love match, a way to unite two powerful families and their competing tech empires. "I'll deal with Gabriela later," Eduardo said. "Right now I need to focus on Matteo." The baby had fallen asleep in his arms, tiny fingers curled around Eduardo's thumb. "Rosa, cancel my meetings tomorrow, all of them." Rosa's eyebrows shot up. In 15 years, Eduardo had never voluntarily cancelled a meeting. "All of them?" "Yes. And find me the best private investigator in the city. I need to locate Marina." "What are you going to do when you find her?" Rosa asked carefully. Eduardo looked down at his son, peacefully sleeping against his chest. "I don't know yet, but I need answers." For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Eduardo Silveira didn't have a plan. And strangely, that didn't terrify him as much as it should have. What terrified him was the fierce, unexpected wave of protectiveness he felt for this tiny human who had crashed into his life. Whatever happened next, Eduardo knew one thing with absolute certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. As dawn broke over the city skyline, Eduardo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, still holding Matteo. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that he had just turned one of the most powerful men in the country's life completely upside down. "Welcome to the world, Matteo Silveira," Eduardo whispered. "Let's figure this out together." 2 weeks had passed since Eduardo found Matteo. The DNA test results sat on his desk in a sealed envelope, though Eduardo already knew what they would say. The baby had his eyes, his chin. Even Rosa had commented on the resemblance. The penthouse had transformed. A nursery now occupied what had been Eduardo's home office, decorated in soft blues and greys. A night nurse named Clara took care of Matteo during the evenings, while Rosa had hired a professional nanny named Maria to help during the day. Eduardo found himself rushing home from work, something he'd never done before. Each evening, he would hold Matteo for hours, sometimes talking to him about his day as though the infant could understand corporate mergers and stock fluctuations. "Ah, you've changed," Rosa remarked one morning as she handed Eduardo the day's schedule. "What do you mean?" Eduardo asked, adjusting his tie. 2 weeks ago, you would have been furious about the Johnson contract delay. Today, you barely noticed when I mentioned it. Eduardo frowned. She was right. His priorities were shifting, and that worried him. Weakness wasn't acceptable in the cutthroat world he operated in. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Silveira, Ms. Vega is here to see you," his secretary announced. Eduardo tensed. "Send her in." Gabriela Vega swept into the office like a storm. At 38, she was striking, tall and elegant with dark hair cut in a sharp bob. Today, she wore a red designer suit that matched her lipstick. "3 cancelled dinners, Eduardo," she said without greeting. "Not even a proper explanation. What's going on?" Eduardo gestured for her to sit. Something unexpected came up. More unexpected than our wedding in 2 months. Gabriela's perfectly shaped eyebrows arched. "The Vega-Silveira merger is all the business world is talking about." That was Gabriela, always. Seeing their relationship in terms of market share and corporate advantage. "There's something I need to tell you," Eduardo said. "Something that might affect our arrangement." Gabriela's eyes narrowed. "You're not backing out, are you?" "Our fathers may be gone, but the rivalry between our companies isn't. This marriage is the only thing preventing a hostile takeover from my board. It's not that, it's..." Eduardo was interrupted by his phone ringing. He checked the screen. "I need to take this. It's important." Gabriela sighed dramatically, but waved her hand in permission. "Silveira," Eduardo answered, turning away from his fiancée's scrutiny. "Mr. Silveira, this is Victor Hayes, the private investigator you hired." Eduardo's heart raced. "Did you find her?" "Yes and no," Hayes replied. "Marina Oliveira left the country a week ago. She's in Brazil, staying with family in Rio." "Do you have an address, contact information?" "Yes, but there's something else you should know." Hayes paused. "She's married, has been for 5 years, to a Carlos Oliveira. He's a professor at the university there." Eduardo felt the floor shift beneath him. "Married? That's impossible. When we were together..." "They were separated at the time, but according to my sources, they reconciled about 7 months ago." The implications hit Eduardo like a physical blow. If Marina had reconciled with her husband 7 months ago... "The baby," Eduardo said quietly. "Does her husband think..." "That's the thing," Hayes continued. "From what I've gathered, her husband..." Doesn't know about the child. She told family she was going on a research trip, came to the States to have the baby, and then returned childless. Eduardo thanked the investigator and ended the call, his mind reeling. "What baby?" Gabriela asked, her voice sharp as glass. Eduardo turned to find her standing much closer than before, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing anger. "That's what I need to tell you about," Eduardo said, making a decision. "Follow me." The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent and tense. When they entered, Maria was sitting in the living room with Matteo in her arms. "Maria, could you give us a moment?" Eduardo asked. The nanny nodded and carefully placed Matteo in his bassinet before disappearing into the kitchen. Gabriela stared at the baby, her face a perfect mask of shock. "What is this?" "This is Matteo," Eduardo said simply. "And who is Matteo?" "To you?" Gabriela's voice was dangerously controlled. Eduardo took a deep breath. "My son." The silence that followed was deafening. "Your son," Gabriela finally repeated. "And when exactly were you planning to mention that you had a child?" "I just found out myself 2 weeks ago. Someone left him in the parking lot after the charity gala with a note." Gabriela laughed, a brittle sound without humor. "This is a joke, right? Some elaborate prank?" "No joke." Eduardo handed her the DNA test results he'd brought from his office. "I had tests done. He's mine." Gabriela scanned the paper, her perfect composure cracking. "The mother. An old relationship. It ended a year ago. And she just abandoned her baby in a parking lot." Gabriela's voice rose in disbelief. "What kind of woman?" "She's married," Eduardo cut in. "She reconciled with her husband while pregnant. He doesn't know about Matteo." Gabriela paced across the penthouse, her high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "This changes everything, Eduardo. The board will see this as a scandal, a liability." "He's a baby, not a liability," Eduardo said, surprised by the defensiveness in his voice. Gabriela stopped pacing and looked at him closely. "You're keeping him." It wasn't a question, but Eduardo answered anyway. "Yes. Have you thought this through? What it means for our merger, for our marriage, our—" Eduardo looked at Matteo, sleeping peacefully in his bassinet. "I'm not giving him up." Gabriela's perfectly manicured hand tightened around her designer purse. "Then we have a problem." Just then, Matteo began to fuss. Without thinking, Eduardo went to the bassinet and picked him up, cradling him with a newfound confidence that surprised even him. Gabriela watched this domestic scene with growing horror. "You've changed." "Maybe I have. I'm not ready to be a stepmother, Eduardo, especially not to some other woman's abandoned child." Gabriela's words were cold, calculated to hurt. Eduardo felt an unfamiliar anger rise within him. "Then maybe you're not ready to be my wife." The words hung in the air between them. Gabriela's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You're choosing this situation over our merger?" "I'm choosing my son," Eduardo said simply. Gabriela looked between Eduardo and the baby, calculation evident in her eyes. "You need time to think rationally about this. We both do. I'll give you a week, Eduardo. Figure out what you really want." She turned toward the elevator, then paused. "And remember what's at stake. Without this marriage, your company is vulnerable. My board has been looking for ways to acquire Silvera Tech for years." After she left, Eduardo sat down with Matteo still in his arms. The baby had fallen back asleep, tiny fingers curled around Eduardo's thumb. "What am I doing, Matteo?" he whispered. "Your arrival has turned my whole life upside down." Yet looking at his son's peaceful face, Eduardo couldn't bring himself to regret it. The following morning, Eduardo sat in his home office, a space he'd recently carved out in the corner of the living room. An ocean of baby items surrounded him, a stark contrast to his usual minimalist style. Rosa entered with coffee. "Rough night." Matteo was colicky, Eduardo said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Clara says, it's normal, but you couldn't sleep knowing he was uncomfortable." Rosa finished with a knowing smile. "That's called being a father, Eduardo." Eduardo stared into his coffee. Gabriella wants me to choose between Matteo and our merger. And? There's no choice to make, Eduardo said firmly. Matteo stays. Rosa nodded, unsurprised. I've scheduled a meeting with the board for tomorrow. If you're going to keep Matteo, they need to hear it from you before the press gets wind of it. You think there will be backlash? Your company makes children's educational software, Eduardo. A secret love child could be spun as either a scandal or a charming human interest story. It depends on how we handle it. Eduardo considered this. We need a statement prepared, something that protects Matteo from media scrutiny. Already working on it, Rosa assured him. The doorbell rang. Maria appeared from the nursery. That must be the new pediatrician for Matteo's checkup. Eduardo nodded. He'd insisted on a house call to avoid being seen at a doctor's office with a baby. Maria opened the door, and a young woman with curly brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail entered. She wore simple slacks and a blouse under a light jacket, carrying a medical bag. Dr. Isabella Santos, she introduced herself, extending her hand to Eduardo. You must be Mr. Silveira. Her handshake was firm, professional. Eduardo noticed she didn't seem intimidated by his wealth or status. A refreshing change. Where's my patient? Dr. Santos asked with a warm smile. Maria led her to Matteo, who was awake in his bassinet. The doctor's demeanor changed instantly, softening as she spoke gently to the baby. Well, hello there, little one, she cooed. Aren't you handsome? Eduardo watched as she examined Matteo with experienced hands, explaining each step of the process. He's developing perfectly, Dr. Santos concluded. Good weight gain, excellent responses. You're doing a great job with him. Eduardo felt an unexpected surge of pride. His night nurse and nanny deserve the credit. Dr. Santos looked at him curiously. Do you hold him often? Yes, whenever I can, Eduardo admitted. Good. Babies need physical contact for proper development. She packed up her equipment. I understand this is an unusual situation, Mr. Silveira. If you have any questions, even ones that seem trivial, please call my cell phone directly. She handed Eduardo her card with her personal number written on the back. Thank you, doctor, Eduardo said, genuinely grateful. I'm new to all of this. All parents are at first, she said with a kind smile. Even the ones who plan for it. After she left, Rosa gave Eduardo a look. What? He asked. Dr. Santos is very pretty, Rosa observed innocently. Eduardo rolled his eyes. I'm not looking for a relationship, Rosa. My engagement is falling apart. I have a new baby, and my company might be facing a hostile takeover. Romance is the last thing on my mind. If you say so, Rosa replied, not bothering to hide her smile. The board meeting the next day went exactly as Eduardo expected. Poorly. Let me get this straight, said Richard Dalton, the oldest board member. You discovered a baby that might be yours, and instead of following proper procedures, you just took him home. The DNA test confirms he's mine, Eduardo replied calmly. And yes, I made a decision to keep him out of the system. The publicity from this could tank our stock price, warned Janet Miller, head of finance. We're about to launch the new educational software platform. The timing couldn't be worse, or it couldn't be better, countered Thomas Chen, the marketing director. Our CEO, a single father, raising his son while running a company that makes learning tools for children? The press will eat it up. The boardroom erupted into heated debate. Eduardo let them argue, watching carefully to gauge who might be allies and who might cause problems. What about the Vega merger? Asked Dalton, silencing the room. Gabriella's father built their company to compete directly with us. This marriage was supposed to end years of competition. Eduardo straightened his tie. The merger is uncertain at this point. Another explosion of voices. This time Eduardo raised his hand for silence. My personal life is my own, he said firmly. But I understand your concerns about the company. That's why I've instructed my team to prepare a statement that frames this in the most positive light. And if the merger with Vega Tech falls through, we have contingency plans. Such as, pressed Dalton. Such as the Japanese investment group I met with last month, Eduardo replied smoothly. They've expressed interest in backing our expansion into Asian markets, something Vega Tech couldn't offer. This silenced the room. Eduardo had built his reputation on always being 2 steps ahead. The board might not like his personal decisions, but they respected his business acumen. "We'll vote on how to proceed," Dalton finally said. "But in the meantime, keep your situation as private as possible." Eduardo nodded, already planning his exit. As the meeting adjourned, Thomas Chen approached him. "For what it's worth," Chen said quietly, "I think you're doing the right thing. My wife and I adopted our daughter 10 years ago. Best decision we ever made." Eduardo felt a rare moment of connection with his marketing director. "Thank you, Thomas." As he left the boardroom, Eduardo's phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator. Marina Oliveira, returning to the US next week. Arriving in Sito Nazao, New York on Tuesday. Her husband is coming with her. Eduardo stared at the message, his heart racing. Marina was coming back with her husband, the man who had no idea that his wife had given birth to another man's child and abandoned the baby in a parking lot. The complexity of the situation hit Eduardo all at once. But strangely, his first thought wasn't about the potential scandal or threat to his company. It was about Mateo. Would Marina want him back now? Would she tell her husband the truth? And if she did, what would that mean for the tiny baby who had so unexpectedly become the center of Eduardo's world? For the first time in his life, Eduardo Silveira was afraid, not of losing money or power, but of losing his son. He made a decision then and there, standing in the hallway outside the boardroom. Whatever happened next, he would fight for Mateo, with everything he had. "Mr. Silveira?" His assistant's voice broke through his thoughts. Dr. Santos called. She wanted to check how Mateo is doing with the new formula. Eduardo smiled despite his worries. "Tell her he's doing well, and ask if she can come for another house call tomorrow. I have some questions about his sleep schedule." As he headed back to his office, Eduardo realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. 2 weeks ago, his priorities had been clear. Business first, personal life a distant second. Now, with Marina's return looming and Gabriella's ultimatum hanging over him, Eduardo faced the biggest challenge of his life. But unlike the corporate battles he'd fought and won, this one wasn't about market share or profit margins. This was about family, the one thing Eduardo had never thought he needed, but now couldn't imagine living without. Tuesday morning arrived with a sense of foreboding. Eduardo stood by the penthouse windows, watching the city come to life while holding Mateo. The baby had just been fed and was contentedly dozing against his father's shoulder. "They land at 10:30, Rosa said, checking her tablet. "Mr. Hayes will track their movements and keep us updated." Eduardo nodded, unable to tear his gaze away from his son's peaceful face. "What am I going to do, Rosa? What if she wants him back?" The question had been haunting him for days. Legally, Marina was Mateo's mother. If she demanded the child's return, Eduardo could face a lengthy custody battle, one that would expose everything to public scrutiny. "One step at a time," Rosa advised. "First, find out what she wants." The elevator pinged, announcing a visitor. Maria went to check and returned with Dr. Santos. "Sorry I'm early," Isabella said. "My previous appointment cancelled." Eduardo found himself oddly glad to see her. Over the past week, the pediatrician had become a steady, calming presence during a turbulent time. "How's our little patient today?" Isabella asked, her smile warming when she saw Mateo. "He slept through the night for the first time," Eduardo reported with pride. Isabella approached, her curly hair pulled back in its usual practical style. "That's excellent progress, may I?" Eduardo carefully transferred Mateo to her arms, watching as she examined him with gentle expertise. "He's thriving," she confirmed. "You're doing everything right." "I have plenty of help," Eduardo said, nodding toward Maria and Rosa. "Yes, but he knows who his father is," Isabella observed. "Watch how he responds to your voice compared to others." As if on cue, Mateo turned his head at the sound of Eduardo's reply. Isabella smiled. "See, babies are smarter than we give them credit for." Eduardo's phone buzzed. A message from Hayes. "Subjects have checked into the Four Seasons Hotel." Eduardo's stomach tightened. "They're here." "Who's here?" Isabella asked, noticing his change in demeanor. Eduardo hesitated, then decided honesty was best. Mateo's mother and her husband, Isabella's eyes widened slightly, but her professional composure quickly returned. I see. Will this be their first time meeting Matteo since she left him in a parking lot? Yes. The harshness in Eduardo's voice surprised even him. Isabella gently placed Matteo in his bassinet. I should go, she said quietly. This sounds like a private family matter. No, Eduardo said quickly. Actually, I'd appreciate your professional opinion. As Matteo's doctor, Isabella tilted her head, considering. What kind of opinion? About what's best for him? Eduardo ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become more frequent since Matteo's arrival. If his biological mother suddenly reappears, how might that affect him? At this age, babies primarily need consistency and security, Isabella explained. Matteo has bonded with you and his caregivers. Sudden changes could be disruptive, but not necessarily harmful long-term if handled properly. Eduardo nodded, absorbing this information. Thank you, Doctor. Isabella, she corrected gently. After all we've been through with midnight calls. About diaper rash, I think we can use first names. The comment lightened the mood momentarily, but Eduardo's phone buzzed again. They're requesting a meeting, Eduardo said, reading Hayes's message. Today, Rosa stepped forward. I'll cancel your appointments. No, Eduardo decided. Let them come here. I want them to see that Matteo has a home, a family. Isabella touched his arm lightly. Would you like me to leave some information about infant development? It might help if there are questions about his care. Please, Eduardo said, grateful for her understanding. As Isabella prepared to leave, she paused. Whatever happens, remember that Matteo is lucky to have someone who cares about him so much. Eduardo watched her go, feeling an unexpected sense of loss at her departure. She likes you, Rosa observed once the elevator doors closed. Not the time. Rosa, Eduardo warned, though he couldn't help but wonder if she was right. At precisely 2 p.m., the elevator announced visitors. Eduardo stood in the center of his living room, a picture of controlled calm, despite the storm raging inside him. The doors opened to reveal a couple. The woman Eduardo recognized immediately, Marina Oliveira, with her distinctive chestnut hair, though she looked thinner and more tired than he remembered. Beside her stood a tall man with glasses and a nervous expression, presumably Carlos, her husband. Eduardo, Marina said softly, her eyes already scanning the room for signs of a baby. Marina, Eduardo replied, his voice neutral. And you must be Carlos. The man nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable. Please, sit, Eduardo gestured, to the sofa. They sat close together, Marina clutching her purse like a shield. Carlos kept glancing between his wife and Eduardo, suspicion evident in his eyes. Where is he? Marina asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sleeping, Eduardo answered. Maria, our nanny, is with him. Marina flinched at the word our. I think we should be clear about why we're here, Carlos said, finding his voice. His accent was pronounced, but his English fluent. My wife has something to tell me, and she insisted it be done in person with you present. Eduardo raised an eyebrow. I see. Marina took a shaky breath. Carlos doesn't know everything yet. I told him we needed to come to New York to resolve something from when we were separated, something important. And that something is my baby, Carlos said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Isn't it? Marina's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. Carlos turned to Eduardo. Are you the father? Yes, Eduardo confirmed. DNA tests confirm it. And you had no idea Marina was married? None, Eduardo assured him. Our relationship ended a year ago. I only learned about Matteo 2 weeks ago, when I found him abandoned after a charity event. Carlos winced at the word abandoned. You left our baby in a parking lot? He asked Marina incredulously. No, Marina corrected, not our baby. I never wanted you to have to know, Carlos. We were just getting back together, finally rebuilding our marriage. How could I tell you I was pregnant with another man's child? So instead you came to America alone, had the baby, and left him for Eduardo to find. Carlos stood up, pacing in agitation. Do you realize you could be arrested for child abandonment? Marina buried her face in her hands. I didn't know what else to do. I left him where I knew Eduardo would find him. I made sure he was safe. Safe? Eduardo's control finally snapped. He was cold and crying when I found him. Anything could have happened to him. The raised voices woke Matteo, and his crying came through the baby monitor on the coffee table. Eduardo moved immediately toward the nursery. I want to see him, Marina said, standing up. Eduardo hesitated, then nodded curtly. Follow me. The 3 adults entered the nursery, where Maria was already comforting the fussing infant. When she saw them, she looked questioningly at Eduardo. It's all right, Maria. You can go. Marina approached the crib slowly, her eyes fixed on Matteo. He's so big already, she whispered. He has your eyes. Eduardo lifted Matteo from the crib, holding him protectively. Would you like to hold him? Marina reached out, then pulled back. I don't think I should. Carlos watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. What do you want, Marina? Eduardo asked directly. Why are you really here? Marina squared her shoulders. I needed to make sure he was okay and... She glanced at Carlos. We needed to resolve this legally. Legally? Eduardo's arms tightened around Matteo. We don't want to take him from you, Carlos clarified, surprising both Eduardo and Marina. That's not why we're here. Marina turned to her husband in shock. Carlos? You made your decision when you left him, Marina, Carlos said, his voice sad but firm. And now I've seen how much Mr. Silvera cares for him. What are you suggesting? Eduardo asked cautiously. Termination of parental rights, Carlos said. Marina's rights, proper legal documentation to ensure the child's future is secure with you, Marina gasped. Carlos, I don't know if... What future were you planning for him, Marina? Carlos asked gently. Did you think we would take him back to Brazil, pretend he was mine, start our reconciliation with a lie? Tears streamed down Marina's face. I just wanted to make things right. Then do the right thing now, Carlos urged. Give Eduardo full legal custody of his son. Eduardo watched this exchange with growing amazement. Of all the scenarios he had, imagined this wasn't one of them. I would need assurances, Eduardo said, his business mind asserting itself. Legal documents that can't be challenged later. My cousin is a family lawyer, Carlos offered. She can draw up the papers. We can sign them before we return to Brazil. Marina stared at her husband. You've already thought this through. I had the entire flight to think about it, Carlos replied. After you finally told me the truth, Marina turned to Eduardo, her eyes on Matteo. Can I at least know his name? What you've been calling him? Matteo, Eduardo said. Matteo Silveira. Marina nodded, a sad smile forming. It suits him. Carlos put his arm around his wife's shoulders. We should go, give Mr. Silveira some time with his son. As they prepared to leave, Marina paused. Eduardo, I am truly sorry for how I handled this. I was scared and confused, but I'm glad he has you. After they left, Eduardo sat in the nursery rocking chair with Matteo against his chest. The baby had settled again, his tiny hand curled around Eduardo's finger. It's going to be okay, Matteo, he whispered. You're staying right here with me. 3 days later, Eduardo sat in a conference room at his lawyer's office. Across the table, Marina and Carlos reviewed the documents with their legal representative. These terms are generous, Marina's lawyer commented, referring to the financial settlement Eduardo had offered in exchange for Marina signing away her parental rights. I don't want your money, Marina said, pushing the settlement papers aside. I just want to know he'll be taken care of. He will be, Eduardo promised. I've already established a trust fund for his education and future. Carlos squeezed Marina's hand. Sign the papers, Marina. It's time to move forward. With a shaky hand, Marina signed the documents officially terminating her parental rights and granting Eduardo sole legal custody of Matteo. There's something else, Eduardo said as the lawyers finalized the paperwork. When Matteo is older, if he has questions about his birth mother, would you be willing to write him a letter explaining your side of things? Something I could give him when the time is right. Marina's eyes filled with tears. Yes, of course, I'll write it before we leave. After everything was signed, they stood awkwardly in the hallway outside the conference room. Our flight leaves. Tomorrow, Carlos said. We won't bother you again. I don't blame you for any of this, Carlos, Eduardo said, offering his hand. You're a good man. Carlos shook it firmly. Take care of him. Marina hesitated, then stepped forward to quickly embrace Eduardo. Goodbye, Eduardo. Please tell Mateo, tell him I'm sorry. Eduardo watched them walk away, feeling an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. Mateo was officially, legally his son. No one could take him away now. As he left the building, Eduardo's phone rang, Gabriela's name flashing on the screen. He had been avoiding her call since their confrontation. Gabriela, he answered. Time's up, Eduardo, she said without preamble. Have you made your decision? Eduardo looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling strangely free. Yes, I have. And I choose Mateo. I'm sorry, Gabriela, but I can't marry you. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. You're making a mistake, Eduardo. A very costly one. Maybe, Eduardo acknowledged. But it's my mistake to make. The board won't be happy. There will be consequences. I'll deal with them, Eduardo said confidently. Your father would be disappointed, Gabriela said, her final attempt to hurt him. Eduardo smiled, thinking of Mateo. No, I don't think he would be. Not this time. He ended the call and climbed into his waiting car. Home, please, he told the driver. I promised Mateo we'd try the park today. The press release went out the following morning. Silvera Technologies CEO Eduardo Silvera announces the end of his engagement to Gabriela Vega, citing personal reasons. Mr. Silvera also wishes to introduce the newest member of his family, his son Mateo, and asks for privacy during this time of transition. The response was immediate. Business channels speculated about the future of the planned merger between Silvera Tech and Vega Industries. Gossip sites ran old photos of Eduardo with various women, trying to identify Mateo's mother. Eduardo ignored it all. He had more important matters to focus on, like Dr. Santos's house call scheduled for that afternoon. When Isabella arrived, she found Eduardo in the living room floor with Mateo on a colorful playmat. Tummy time, she observed with approval. Eduardo grinned. Maria says it helps strengthen his neck muscles. Isabella sat cross-legged on the floor opposite Eduardo, placing her medical bag aside. I saw the news. Are you okay? Better than okay, Eduardo admitted. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Even with the business complications. Eduardo shrugged. Companies rise and fall, stock prices recover. But family, that's irreplaceable. Isabella smiled. You're not at all what I expected, Eduardo Silvera. What did you expect? The cold, calculating businessman from the magazine covers. Not this devoted father on the floor doing tummy time. Eduardo laughed. Mateo has changed me. Children have. A way of doing that, Isabella agreed, helping Mateo roll onto his back. As she examined him, she added casually, I also heard about the custody agreement. News travels fast, Eduardo remarked. My cousin works at the family court, Isabella explained. She mentioned a high-profile case involving a certain CEO. Don't worry, everything remains confidential. It's for the best, Eduardo said, watching Isabella check Mateo's reflexes. Marina and her husband are returning to Brazil today. She signed away her parental rights. How do you feel about that? Isabella asked, her attention seemingly on Mateo, but her question clearly directed at Eduardo. Relieved, sad for Mateo in some ways, but mostly determined to be the best father I can be. Single parenting isn't easy, Isabella cautioned. I'm learning that, Eduardo agreed, but I have help. Rosa, Maria, Clara, and you. Isabella looked up, meeting his eyes. My role is purely professional. Of course, Eduardo said quickly. I just meant, I know what you meant, Isabella interrupted with a small smile, and I appreciate it. But given everything you're going through right now, adding complications probably isn't wise. Eduardo raised an eyebrow. Complications? Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about, Isabella said, her cheeks flushing slightly. I've seen how you look at me sometimes. Eduardo found himself momentarily speechless, a rare occurrence. I didn't realize I was being so obvious. You weren't, she assured him. I'm just observant. It's part of being a good doctor. And what have you observed? Eduardo asked, suddenly very interested in her answer. Isabella focused on packing up her medical supplies. A man going through major life changes who might be confusing gratitude with other feelings. I'm very clear about my feelings, Isabella. She looked up at him, her expression serious. Matteo needs stability right now. So do you. I agree, Eduardo said, which is why I'd like to ask you something. Isabella waited, eyebrow raised. Would you have dinner with me? Not here, not as Matteo's doctor, just dinner to talk about anything but baby's business or ex-fiancés, Eduardo promised with a smile. Isabella considered for a moment. I don't date my patients' parents as a rule. Eduardo's heart sank. I understand. But, she continued, I could refer Matteo to my colleague, Dr. Chen. He's excellent with infants. Eduardo's smile returned. Does that mean yes? It means I'll think about it, Isabella replied, but her smile suggested her answer might eventually be yes. As she prepared to leave, Eduardo's phone rang. It was Thomas Chen from the marketing department. Eduardo, you need to see the news right away, Chen said urgently. Eduardo frowned. What's happening? Gabriella just announced a hostile takeover bid for Silvera Tech. They're making an offer to your shareholders, 20% above market value. Eduardo's blood ran cold. She's not wasting any time. The board is calling an emergency meeting. They want you there in an hour. Eduardo ended the call and turned to Isabella, who had heard enough to understand the situation was serious. Business. Crisis? She asked. Gabriella is trying to take my company, Eduardo explained, already texting Rosa to return to the penthouse immediately. I should go, Isabella said, gathering her things. Isabella, Eduardo called as she reached the elevator. About dinner. She smiled despite the tension in the air. Handle your company first, Eduardo. Matteo and I will still be here when the dust settles. After she left, Eduardo looked down at his son, peacefully playing on his mat, oblivious to the corporate warfare about to erupt. Don't worry, Matteo, he said softly. I won't let Gabriella take anything else from us, not my company and certainly not our future. Eduardo picked up his son, holding him close. In that moment, he made a silent promise. He would fight for his company with everything he had, not for the power or the money, but because it was Matteo's legacy. The empire he had built would someday belong to his son, and no one, not even Gabriella Vega, was going to take that away. As Maria arrived to take Matteo for his nap, Eduardo straightened his tie and prepared for battle. The board was waiting. The shareholders were watching, and his former fiancée had just declared war. But for the first time in his life, Eduardo Silvera was fighting for something more important than business success. He was fighting for his family, and that made all the difference. The Silvera Technologies boardroom crackled with tension. Eduardo sat at the head of the table, outwardly calm despite the storm raging around him. A 20% premium is extremely generous, Richard Dalton was saying. Many shareholders will jump at this offer. It's not generous, it's predatory, Eduardo countered. Gabriella knows our new educational software launches next month. She's trying to acquire us before our stock price rises naturally. Janet Miller, the finance director, nodded. Eduardo's right. This hostile takeover is timed to catch us at our most vulnerable. Which we wouldn't be if the merger had proceeded as planned, Dalton shot back. A merger that fell apart because of your personal situation. Eduardo didn't flinch at the thinly veiled reference to Matteo. My personal life is not relevant to this discussion. It became relevant when you chose a baby over a business alliance that would have secured our company's future. Dalton's face reddened with anger. Enough. Eduardo's voice was quiet but commanding. Gabriella Vega has launched a hostile takeover. Bid. We can debate why later. Right now we need a strategy to counter it. Thomas Chen spoke up. What about the Japanese investors? You mentioned they were interested in our Asian expansion. Eduardo nodded. Takashi Group. They've been looking for a foothold in the educational technology market. Could they serve as a white knight? Janet asked. Possibly, Eduardo said. I have a meeting with them tomorrow, but we need more than just alternative investors. He turned to the company's legal counsel. What defensive measures can we implement immediately? The next hour was spent discussing poison pills, staggered board elections, and other anti-takeover strategies. As the meeting concluded, Dalton lingered behind. "You know this wouldn't be happening if you'd stuck to the plan," the older man said. Eduardo regarded him coolly. "The plan was to expand Silvera Technologies and secure its future. That hasn't changed." "No. The plan was to marry Gabriela Vega and unite our companies," Dalton corrected. "Instead, you let a foundling baby derail everything we've worked for." "That foundling baby is my son," Eduardo said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And this company will be his legacy someday, which is exactly why I won't let Gabriela take it." Dalton shook his head. "Your father would have never allowed personal feelings to interfere with business." "My father died alone with nothing but his money to comfort him," Eduardo replied. "I plan to do better." Eduardo returned to the penthouse late that night. Despite the hour, he went straight to the nursery, needing to see Matteo. The sight of his son sleeping peacefully in his crib calmed Eduardo's racing mind. Clara, the night nurse, looked up from her chair in the corner. "He's been perfect," she whispered. "Went down at 8 without a fuss." "Thank you, Clara," Eduardo said quietly. "Why don't you take a break? I'll sit with him for a while." After she left, Eduardo carefully lifted Matteo and settled into the rocking chair. The baby stirred but didn't wake, nestling against his father's chest. Eduardo breathed in the soft scent of baby shampoo, feeling the day's tension begin to melt away. "I'm not going to let them take my company, Matteo," he whispered. "And I'm certainly not going to let them take you." His phone vibrated with a text message. Eduardo shifted Matteo to check it, surprised to see Isabella's name on the screen. "Heard about the takeover bid on the news. Hope you're okay. Call if you need a friendly ear." Eduardo smiled, typing a response with one hand. "Just sitting with Matteo. He's better therapy than any friendly ear. But thank you for offering both." Her reply came quickly. "Smart man. Babies have a way of putting things in perspective." Eduardo hesitated, then added, "That dinner offer still stands, once this business crisis is resolved." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. "I'm holding you to that. Now get some sleep, CEO. Tomorrow's another battle." Eduardo put his phone away, oddly comforted by the brief exchange. He looked down at Matteo, still sleeping soundly against him. "Your dad's got a lot to figure out, little man," he murmured, "but we're going to be okay." The next morning brought chaos. Silvera Vega was trending on social media, with business analysts speculating about the potential takeover. Eduardo's phone rang constantly as he prepared for his meeting with the Takashi Group. "The shareholders are nervous," Rosa reported, following Eduardo from room to room as he got ready. "Dalton's been calling some of the major investors." "Whose side is he on?" Eduardo asked, adjusting his tie. "His own," Rosa replied. "He's positioning himself to land on his feet, regardless of who ends up controlling the company." Eduardo wasn't surprised. Dalton had been his father's closest ally on the board, the old guard looking out for their interests above all else. "The Takashi meeting is at 10, Rosa continued, "and Dr. Santos called. Matteo's regular checkup is scheduled for this afternoon, but she offered to reschedule given the circumstances." Eduardo paused. "No, keep the appointment. Some things shouldn't be postponed, even for corporate wars." Rosa smiled knowingly, but said nothing. As Eduardo prepared to leave, he stopped by the nursery to say goodbye to Matteo. Maria was changing him, talking softly in Spanish as she did so. "Be good for Maria," Eduardo told his son, kissing his forehead. "Daddy has to go save our company." Maria looked up. "You will win, Mr. Silvera, you always do." "I hope you're right, Maria," Eduardo replied, wishing he felt as confident as she sounded. The meeting with the Takashi Group took place in a private dining room at the Four Seasons. Hideki Takashi, the patriarch of the family business, listened intently as Eduardo outlined his proposal. "So you are seeking a strategic investment to fend off this hostile takeover," the older man summarized. "Yes," Eduardo confirmed. Silvera Technologies would gain a partner for Asian expansion, and Takashi Group would gain access to our educational software platform. Hideki nodded thoughtfully. "And what of the personal element to this situation? The news reports mention Fair broken engagement and a new child. Eduardo hadn't expected such a direct question. In Japanese business culture, personal matters were typically kept separate from business discussions, but Hideki Takashi was known for his unconventional approach. Yes, I recently discovered I have a son, Eduardo said honestly. And yes, my engagement to Gabriela Vega ended as a result. I see. Hideki studied Eduardo carefully. In my experience, Mr. Silveira, how a man treats his family reflects how he treats his business partners. Eduardo met the older man's gaze steadily. I agree completely, which is why I chose my son over a business merger that would have been advantageous but loveless. And it's why I'm fighting now to protect my company, because it will someday belong to him. A small smile appeared on Hideki's face. A father's duty is to build a legacy worth inheriting. I respect that greatly. He turned to his associates and spoke rapidly in Japanese before addressing Eduardo again. We are prepared to make an investment in Silveira Technologies. Our legal team will draft the necessary paperwork today. Relief washed over Eduardo. Thank you, Mr. Takashi. There is one condition, Hideki added. I would like to meet your son. Eduardo blinked in surprise. My son? Hideki nodded. In Japan, business is family. I do not invest in companies, Mr. Silveira. I invest in people and their families. That afternoon, Eduardo returned to the penthouse to find Isabella already there, playing with Matteo on the living room floor. She looked up with a smile that momentarily made Eduardo forget about takeover bids and strategic investments. He's getting stronger, she reported. Watch how he tries to roll over now. Eduardo sat down on the floor beside them, loosening his tie. Sorry I'm late. Maria let me in, Isabella explained. I hope that's okay. More than okay, Eduardo assured, her watching as Matteo grabbed for a colorful toy. How's he doing? Perfectly on track developmentally, Isabella said. But you didn't need a doctor to tell you that. You know your son well already. Eduardo smiled, the simple praise warming him more than any business accolade ever had. How did your meetings go? Isabella asked. We secured an investment from the Takashi Group, Eduardo replied. They're drafting the paperwork now. That's wonderful. Isabella's genuine happiness for his success touched Eduardo. There's one unusual condition, he added. Mr. Takashi wants to meet Matteo. Isabella raised her eyebrows. That's different. He says he invests in families, not just companies. Eduardo watched Matteo trying to reach for a toy just beyond his grasp. They're coming here tomorrow evening. Then we should make sure Matteo makes a good impression on his first business meeting, Isabella joked, tickling the baby's tummy. Eduardo caught her hand impulsively. Thank you. For what? I'm just doing my job, Isabella replied, though she didn't pull her hand away. No, you're doing much more than that, Eduardo said softly. You've been a source of stability during the most chaotic time of my life. Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly. Eduardo, I know, he interrupted with a smile. Bad timing, complicated situation, doctor-patient relationship. Ex-doctor-patient relationship, Isabella corrected. Remember, I referred Matteo to Dr. Chen. So that dinner, Eduardo began hopefully, is still a possibility, Isabella finished. After your company is safe. Eduardo was about to respond when the elevator pinged. Rosa rushed in, her usually calm demeanor visibly shaken. Eduardo, we have a problem, she announced. Gabriela has upped her offer to 30% above market value, and she's called another press conference for this evening. Eduardo stood up, the brief moment of peace shattered. What's her game? She knows I've secured the Takashi investment. It gets worse, Rosa continued. Someone leaked information about Marina and the custody situation. It's all over the financial news. Eduardo's blood ran cold. How? I don't know. But the story they're running suggests you coerced Marina into giving up her rights. They're questioning your ethics, your judgment. Dalton, Eduardo growled. It has to be him. Isabella had gathered Matteo in her arms, protective despite not fully understanding the situation. What does this mean? Eduardo turned to her, his expression grim. It means Gabriela is attacking on two fronts, trying to tank our stock by destroying my reputation. while simultaneously offering shareholders an inflated price to sell. "Will it work?" Isabella asked quietly. "It might," Eduardo admitted. "The Takashi investment helps, but if enough shareholders believe I've become a liability..." His phone rang. Hideki Takashi. "Mr. Takashi," Eduardo answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just about to call you. I have seen the news, Mr. Silveira," the Japanese businessman said gravely. Eduardo closed his eyes, bracing for the worst. "My car will arrive at your building in 30 minutes, Takashi continued. "We have much to discuss before tomorrow's shareholder meeting." After hanging up, Eduardo looked at Isabella, still holding Matteo protectively. "I have to go meet with Takashi. The investment might be in jeopardy." "Go," Isabella urged. "We'll be fine here." Eduardo hesitated, torn between business crisis and his son. "Eduardo," Isabella said firmly, "Matteo is safe. Go save his legacy." With a grateful nod, Eduardo left, not missing the irony that just weeks ago, nothing would have made him hesitate when business called. The Takashi Group had taken over a conference room at the Four Seasons. When Eduardo arrived, he found not only Hideki, but also a team of lawyers and PR specialists. "These allegations," Hideki began without preamble, "are they true?" "Absolutely not," Eduardo replied firmly. "I did not coerce Marina. She voluntarily relinquished her parental rights with her husband's full support." Hideki studied him carefully. "And the child was abandoned?" "Yes, but not in the reckless way the stories suggest. Marina left him where she knew I would find him, with a note identifying me as the father." Hideki nodded slowly. "Family matters are complicated, but public perception is simple and powerful. The timing of these stories is not coincidental," Eduardo explained. "Gabriela is using them to destabilize shareholder confidence before tomorrow's vote." "Yes, this is clear," Hideki agreed. "The question is, how do we counter it?" Eduardo was surprised by the "we." "You're still willing to partner with Silveira Tech?" "I said I invest in families, Mr. Silveira. A man who fights for his child is a man who will fight for what matters." Hideki gestured to his team. "Which is why we have prepared a joint strategy." For the next 2 hours, Eduardo worked with the Takashi team on a comprehensive response. A press release announcing the strategic partnership, statements from the Takashi Group expressing full confidence in Eduardo's leadership, and, most surprisingly, a personal statement from Eduardo about becoming a father. "The personal element is what Ms. Vega is using against you," Hideki explained. "So we must use it as your strength instead." As the meeting concluded, Hideki held Eduardo back. "There is one more thing. My wife would like to join us for dinner tomorrow. She is most interested in meeting both your son and the doctor my associates tell me has been so helpful." Eduardo was momentarily taken aback. "Dr. Santos, she's Matteo's pediatrician." Hideki smiled knowingly. "Is that all she is? My sources suggest otherwise." "Your sources are very thorough," Eduardo commented, wondering just how much the Takashi Group had investigated. "Him?" "Always," Hideki confirmed. "So shall we say 7 o'clock at your home? My wife is looking forward to it." When Eduardo returned to the penthouse, he found Isabella still there, reading a story to Matteo in the nursery. The domestic scene stopped. Him in his tracks. "You're still here," he said, leaning against the doorframe. Isabella looked up from the book. "Maria had a family emergency. I offered to stay until you got back." "Thank you." Eduardo approached, sitting on the ottoman near the rocking chair. "How is he?" "Fascinated by pictures of ducks," Isabella replied with a smile. "Blissfully unaware of corporate drama." "I wish I could say the same," Eduardo sighed. "The good news is that Takashi is still on board. The bad news is that tomorrow will be tough. The shareholder meeting could go either way." Isabella closed the book. "And what happens if you lose?" "Then Gabriela takes control of the company my father built. The company I've spent my life growing." Isabella studied his face. "Kauno, a month ago I think that would have destroyed you." "A month ago Matteo wasn't in my life," Eduardo acknowledged, gently touching his son's cheek. Losing the company would still be devastating, but you have something more. Important now, Isabella finished for him. Eduardo nodded. Exactly. That's how I knew you'd be a good father, Isabella said softly. From that first day, you instinctively understood what mattered most. Their eyes met, and Eduardo felt the connection between them strengthening. I have a favor to ask, he said. Hideki, Takashi, and his wife are coming for dinner tomorrow evening. They've specifically requested that you join us. Isabella looked surprised. Me? Why? Apparently, the Takashi group is very thorough in their research, Eduardo explained with a small smile. They know you've been helping with Matteo. So this is a business dinner? Isabella clarified, a hint of disappointment in her voice. Technically, yes, Eduardo admitted, but it's also Hideki's way of evaluating my personal life. He says he invests in families, not just companies. Isabella considered this. All right, I'll come. But only because it might help secure Matteo's inheritance, she added with a teasing smile. Of course, Eduardo agreed, matching her tone. Purely professional. Their laughter woke Matteo, who blinked sleepily at them both. The next morning dawned, clear and bright, shareholder meeting day. Eduardo dressed carefully in his most expensive suit, armor for the battle ahead. Rosa arrived early, bringing the latest updates. The Takashi partnership announcement has steadied the stock somewhat, but Gabriella's PR team is working overtime. They've even dug up that old scandal involving your father and the Brazilian land deal. Ancient history, Eduardo dismissed. The shareholders care about future profits, not decades-old controversies. Some of them care about both, Rosa warned, especially when Gabriella is framing you as another Silvera man who can't be trusted. Eduardo clenched his jaw but said nothing. His father's questionable business practices had always been a shadow over his own career, one he'd worked hard to escape. The car is waiting, Rosa reminded him gently. Maria has everything prepared for the Takashi dinner tonight. Eduardo nodded, then made his way to the nursery for what had become his morning ritual. A few minutes with Matteo before facing the world. Today's a big day, little man, he told his son, who was happily playing in his crib. Daddy's going to fight. For our company, Matteo gurgled happily, reaching up for Eduardo's face. Whatever happens, Eduardo promised, we're going to be okay. The shareholders' meeting was every bit as contentious as Eduardo had expected. Gabriella sat in the front row, elegant in a navy suit, her expression coolly confident. Next to her sat her father's longtime lawyer, Howard Vega, the architect of many corporate takeovers. Dalton opened the proceedings with a clinical assessment of the competing offers. On one hand, we have Ms. Vega's cash offer at 30% above current market value. On the other, we have Mr. Silvera's plan to maintain independent control with a strategic investment from the Takashi Group. Eduardo took the podium next, addressing the room of investors directly. Silvera Technologies has always been about innovation and long-term vision. The Takashi partnership allows us to expand into Asian markets while maintaining our corporate identity and direction. Gabriella countered with her own presentation, emphasizing immediate returns and stability. Recent events have called into question the judgment of current leadership, she said, her gaze fixed pointedly on Eduardo. Vega Industries offers not only premium value, but also experienced, stable management. The debate continued for hours, with shareholders asking pointed questions about both proposals. Throughout it all, Eduardo maintained his composure, even when Gabriella made thinly veiled references to his unexpected family situation. Finally, it was time for the vote. As the shareholders marked their ballots, Eduardo caught Gabriella watching. Him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She believed she had won. The counting seemed to take forever. Eduardo sat perfectly still, outwardly calm, while his heart raced. This was his father's company, his company. Soon to be Matteo's company. Dalton read the results with a carefully neutral expression. By a margin of 3%, the shareholders have elected to maintain current management and accept the Takashi strategic partnership. A murmur ran through the room. Eduardo exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. He had won, barely, but enough. Gabriella's face hardened, her eyes flashing with anger as she gathered her things. As the room began to empty, she approached Eduardo. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "You won a battle, not the war." "It's over, Gabriella," Eduardo replied firmly. "Go build something of your own instead of trying to take what others have built. You'll regret this," she promised, both professionally and personally. Eduardo watched her leave, knowing her threat wasn't empty. Gabriela Vega wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. But for now at least, Silvera Technologies was safe. Hideki Takashi approached, offering his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Silvera. A close victory, but a victory nonetheless." "Thank you for your support," Eduardo said sincerely. "Without the Takashi Group's backing, I might have lost today." Hideki smiled. "We make a good team. I look forward to dinner tonight. My wife is eager to meet the man who chose family over business and still managed to keep both." Eduardo returned to the penthouse feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. The victory had been narrow, but decisive enough to secure his position. He found the apartment transformed. The dining area had been elegantly set for a formal dinner, with fresh flowers and Eduardo's best china. "Maria outdid herself," Rosa commented, checking the final preparations. "The caterers are finishing in the kitchen, and everything is ready for the Takashi's arrival." "And Matteo?" Eduardo asked. "Freshly bathed and dressed in that adorable outfit. Isabella brought over yesterday," Rosa replied with a smile. "Speaking of whom, she called to confirm she'll be here at 6:30. Eduardo checked his watch. Just enough time to shower and change before his guests arrived. As he stood under the hot water, Eduardo reflected on how completely his life had changed in just 1 month. From confirmed bachelor focused solely on business to single father defending his company for his son's future. And somewhere in the midst of all that chaos, he had found Isabella, a woman unlike anyone he'd ever been drawn to before. By the time Isabella arrived, Eduardo was dressed in a casual but elegant outfit, bouncing Matteo gently in his arms. "Someone looks handsome," Isabella remarked, smiling at Matteo in his tiny blue sweater and soft pants. "Both someones, actually," she added, looking at Eduardo. "You look beautiful," Eduardo replied honestly. Isabella had traded her usual practical clothing for a simple emerald dress that brought out the green in her eyes. "Victory looks good on you," she observed. "Congratulations on the shareholder vote." "It was close," Eduardo admitted. "Too close, but you won." Isabella gently touched his arm. "That's what matters." The elevator announced the arrival of the Takashis. Hideki entered with a petite, elegant woman who Eduardo assumed was his wife Mariko. After introductions, Mariko immediately approached Matteo. "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. Eduardo carefully transferred his son to her experienced grip. Mariko spoke softly to Matteo in Japanese, and the baby responded with delighted gurgles. "He has your eyes," she told Eduardo with a smile. "Strong and observant." "Dr. Santos says he's very alert for his age," Eduardo replied proudly. Mariko turned, her attention to Isabella. "Ah, the doctor. My husband speaks highly of you, though he has never met you before tonight." Isabella looked surprised. "Mr. Takashi has been very thorough in his research. My wife means that I mentioned your importance in Mr. Silvera's life," Hideki explained smoothly. "Any person who helps care for a man's child becomes part of his inner circle." The dinner proceeded pleasantly, with conversation flowing easily between business, child-rearing, and cultural differences between Japan and America. Eduardo noticed how naturally Isabella fit into the discussion, her intelligence and warmth complementing his more reserved nature. As dessert was served, Hideki raised his glass. "To new partnerships, both business and personal." Eduardo caught Isabella's eye as they toasted, a silent question passing between them. After dinner, while Mariko was enchanting Matteo with a traditional Japanese lullaby, Hideki drew Eduardo aside. "You have built a fine family, Mr. Silvera," the older man observed. "Not traditional perhaps, but genuine." "We're not exactly a family yet," Eduardo clarified, glancing toward Isabella. Hideki followed his gaze. Some foundations take time to build, but I see the structure forming already. He pressed a small box into Eduardo's hand. A gift. In Japan, we believe that new beginnings should be marked with a token of good fortune. Inside the box lay a small jade figurine, a father holding a child. "It's beautiful," Eduardo said, genuinely touched. "My father gave it to me when my first son was born," Hideki explained. "Now I pass it to you." As the evening concluded, Eduardo walked the Takashis to the elevator. Mariko kissed Matteo's forehead gently before returning him to Eduardo's arms. "Children, change everything," she told him wisely. "They show us what truly matters." After the Takashis departed, Eduardo found Isabella in the nursery, putting away the toys Matteo had scattered during the evening. "That went well," she said, straightening up. "They're lovely people." "Yes, they are," Eduardo agreed, placing a sleeping Matteo in his crib, "and remarkably perceptive." "How so?" Eduardo stepped closer to her. "Hideki seems convinced that you're already part of my family." Isabella's cheeks flushed slightly. "That's presumptuous of him." "Is it?" Eduardo asked softly. "Because I'm starting to think he might be right." Isabella looked up at him, her expression uncertain. "Eduardo, we barely know each other." "I know that you're kind, intelligent, and remarkable with my son," Eduardo replied. "I know that you've seen me at my worst, sleep-deprived, stressed, fighting for my company, and you're still here." "As Matteo's doctor," Isabella reminded him, though her tone lacked conviction. "Former doctor," Eduardo corrected with a smile, "which means there's nothing stopping me from asking you to dinner. A real dinner, not a business meeting with Japanese investors." Isabella smiled despite herself. "You're very persistent." "I'm a businessman. Persistence is how I win." "And is that what this is?" Isabella challenged. "Another negotiation to win?" Eduardo shook his head. "No. This is me acknowledging that Matteo's arrival changed everything in my life, including the kind of relationship I want." He took her hand gently. "Before him, I saw relationships as strategic alliances, convenient arrangements, but now..." "Now?" Isabella prompted. "Now I want something real," Eduardo finished simply, "and I think it could be real with you." Isabella studied his face. "You know I'm not Gabriela. I don't have wealth or connections or..." "Thank God for that," Eduardo interrupted with feeling. "I don't want another Gabriela. I want you exactly as you are." For a moment, Isabella was silent. Then she squeezed his hand. "Dinner?" she agreed. "Let's start with dinner and see where it goes." Eduardo smiled, feeling as though he'd won something far more valuable than any business deal. "Tomorrow night." "Tomorrow night," Isabella confirmed with a smile. As she prepared to leave, Eduardo walked her to the elevator. "Thank you for coming tonight. The Takashis were clearly impressed by you." "By us," Isabella corrected. "They see something forming here, even if we're just beginning to see it ourselves." Eduardo leaned forward and gently kissed her cheek. "Good night, Isabella." "Good night," she replied softly. After she left, Eduardo returned to the nursery where Matteo slept peacefully. He placed the jade figurine Hideki had given him on the shelf above the crib. "Things are looking up, little man," he whispered to his son. "The company is safe, and I think we might be building something even more important than a business empire." 6 months later, Eduardo stood in his office looking out at the city skyline. Silvera Technologies' stock had not only recovered but reached new heights following the successful launch of their educational software platform in Asian markets. The Takashi partnership had proven even more valuable than anticipated, opening doors Eduardo hadn't known existed. The business was thriving beyond his expectations, but more importantly, so was his personal life. The elevator dinged, and Eduardo turned to see Isabella enter, carrying Matteo. At 9 months old, his son was now alert and curious about everything, constantly babbling and trying to crawl. "Da da da," Matteo called out, reaching for Eduardo. Eduardo took him with practiced ease, kissing Isabella softly as he did so. "How was the park?" "Beautiful," Isabella replied. He loved the ducks at the pond. In the months since the shareholder battle, Isabella had become a constant presence in their lives. What had started as dinner had gradually evolved into something deeper, more meaningful than any relationship Eduardo had previously known. "Rosa called," Isabella said, setting Matteo's bag on the sofa. "She said the board unanimously approved the expansion plans." "They did," Eduardo confirmed. "Even Dalton voted in favor, though I suspect that has more to do with the profit projections than any genuine change of heart." Isabella smiled. "You won them over, just like you won me over." "Best victory of my life," Eduardo said, meaning it completely. He shifted Matteo to one arm and reached into his pocket with his free hand. "Which reminds me." He pulled out a small velvet box, watching Isabella's eyes widen in surprise. "Eduardo," she began, her voice catching. "I know it's only been 6 months," Eduardo said quickly, "and we can wait as long as you want before making anything official, but I need you to know that I'm certain about this, about us." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "You and Matteo have shown me what really matters in life. I love you, Isabella. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Isabella's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Eduardo slipped the ring onto her finger, Matteo clapped, his hands together, as if approving this new development in their family story. "See?" Eduardo laughed. "Even Matteo thinks it's a good idea." Isabella leaned in to kiss them both, first Eduardo, then Matteo's forehead. "From the moment you found him in that box, he's been changing your life for the better." "Our lives," Eduardo corrected. "He brought us together, the greatest secret anyone ever left in a box." That night, as Eduardo tucked Matteo into his crib, he reflected on the whirlwind journey of the past 7 months. From the cold parking lot where he'd found a tiny baby, to this moment, with his company secure, his son thriving, and the woman he loved wearing his ring. The man who had once valued control and predictability above all else had learned to embrace the beautiful chaos of family life. The man who had once measured success in dollars and market share now measured it in Matteo's smiles and Isabella's love. As he turned on the nightlight, Eduardo whispered to his sleeping son, "You were the best surprise of my life, Matteo. The secret in the box that changed everything." From the doorway, Isabella watched them with love in her eyes. "Ready for our own happy ending?" she asked softly. Eduardo joined her, wrapping his arm around her waist. "Not an ending," he corrected, "just the beginning of our story together." And as they stood there, watching over the sleeping child who had brought them together, Eduardo knew with absolute certainty that no business success, no corporate victory, would ever compare to the joy of the family he had found, the family they were building together. The secret in the box had given him far more than a son. It had given him a heart. The end.